What's up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It's the Shield Brother here for the History Mod back once again. I know it's been a while, but we're back. My New Year's resolution on this January 1st, 2020 is that I hope to begin to remake these videos. Even if it's just monthly, I'm hoping to at least start pumping out some historical content and some educational content and just really enjoy this again. So, today we're talking about January 1st, 1863. On this day, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln. The signing did not abolish slavery as Lincoln excluded Union states in his order, but it was an important stepping stone in the American Civil War. For those people who are watching that don't know what the Emancipation Proclamation was, it was when the American Civil War was raging. Abraham Lincoln had carefully framed the conflict as concerning the preservation of the Union rather than the abolition of slavery. Although he personally found the practice of slavery abhorrent, he hated it. He was a staunch opponent to any form of slavery. He knew that neither Northerners nor the residents of the border slave states would support abolition as a war aim. But by mid-1862, as thousands of slaves fled to join the invading Northern armies, Lincoln was convinced that abolition had become a sound military strategy, as well as the morally correct path for the Union. On September 22nd, soon after the Union victory at Antietam, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation declaring that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebellious states shall be thenceforward and forever free, to quote Abraham Lincoln. While the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave, it was an important turning point in the war, transforming the fight to preserve the nation into a battle for human freedom and human rights. It was, like I said, a very important stepping stone. Most Republicans had become convinced by 1862 that the war against a slaveholders' rebellion must become a war against slavery itself. And they put increasing pressure on President Lincoln to proclaim an emancipation policy. This would have comported with Lincoln's personal convictions, and combined with these, that it was the right thing to do. It was really the pressure from the Republicans at the time, which I should point out, the Republican Party back then is not the same Republican Party as today, but I digress. The pressures from the Republicans really put and combined with Lincoln's personal beliefs. But as president, he felt compelled to balance these convictions against the dangers of alienating himself from half of the Union consistency. By the summer of 1862, however, it was clear that he risked alienating the Republican half of his constituency, if he did not act against slavery itself. Here you can see the staunch. So, that being said, he began to take actions with the Republican aid to take steps towards freedom of the African populace and more steps towards them. So with Congress's approval, Lincoln in 1862, with partial compensation, ended slavery in the District of Columbia. This long-standing issue was now addressable since the senators of the states in rebellion, who had blocked such a measure so as not to set a precedent, left Congress in 1861. So now that those congressmen and senators that had been a staunch opponent to emancipation, he was able to finally take steps towards his goal. As for the states, Lincoln believed that he had no authority as president to end slavery. He believed it was a state matter. However, Lincoln was not only president at this time, but he was also commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and as such, he could take military measures. His order carefully limited the proclamation to those areas in insurrection. With civil government was not respected and his military authority therefore applied. Since they were in open rebellion, his commander-in-chief authority came president over their state rights. That was what was held as belief at this time. As a war measure, it hurt the South economically by removing its labor force, or at least that was the goal. and helping the Union militarily by making Union soldiers out of freed slaves. And it took an implicit statement towards black citizenship by accepting blacks as soldiers and trusting them with arms, as you can see pictured here. Up until this point, there had been no black regiments in combat positions in the Army. The proclamation also ended any chances of the Confederate government regaining recognition from England or France, which were anti-slavery, and whose support for the Union had increased with this proclamation. It marked a major shift in the stated goals of the war, admitting what the South had claimed all along: the Union was fighting the war to end slavery. Psychologically, it was the turning point of the war, and it stands for what the war was actually on. So, here you can see another picture of these black slaves, these freedmen who were joining up with the Union Army. The freedmen were actually a very large source of manpower for the Union Army during the American Civil War. One of the main reasons that the South lost was manpower and efficiency. The Union was able to crank out more soldiers, although they were much less trained and a much rougher stock than the Southern well-trained soldiers and civilian who was, able to shoot a firearm, being from the South, from the hunting lands, etc. But nevertheless, the population of Union soldier that the freedmen provided was substantial in the Union victory. So, that brings us to the proclamation. This picture got corrupted. Okay, so 1 month later, after the qualified Union victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation warning that in all states still in rebellion by January 1st, 1863, he would declare their slaves there to, quote, thenceforward and forever free. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued this preliminary warning. And by January 1st, 1863, none of the Confederate states had done so and were still in open rebellion, and Lincoln's orders were signed and took effect on January 1st, 1863. Here you can see a blown up version. If you want to pause the video and read the actual proclamation, there's a copy right here on the slide for you. The Emancipation Proclamation outraged white Southerners and their sympathizers who saw it as the beginning of a race war like in Haiti, which had feared them from the very beginning. It angered some Northern Democrats, energized abolitionists, and undermined those Europeans that wanted to intervene to help the Confederacy. The proclamation lifted spirits, and it was an important stepping stone, and it really lifted the spirits of the African Americans on both free and slave populations. It led many slaves to escape from their masters and get to the Union lines to obtain their freedom, and to join the Union Army. When January 1st had come, and with the final proclamation being in place, which committed the government and armed forces of the United States to liberate the slaves in rebellion areas, it is quoted as an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. The proclamation exempted the border slave states and all or parts of 3 Confederate states controlled by the Union Army at the time. Again, this was only in place and effective in places that were in open rebellion. The proclamation also authorized the recruitment of freed slaves and free blacks as Union soldiers during the next 2.5 years. 180,000 of them fought in the Union Army. Here we can see the actual statistic, and 10,000 of them were in the Navy. So you can see that overall there was 190,000 freedmen that would become a fighting force for the Union armies. And it was a vital contribution to the Union victory as well as their own freedom. Emancipation would vastly increase the stakes at war. It became a war for a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln stated in the Gettysburg Address. A war that would transform Southern society by destroying its basic institution of slavery. So this laid the foundation for what would become the 13th Amendment. Meanwhile, Lincoln and the Republican Party recognized the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, not as a civilian measure. This might have no constitutional validity after the war was over. That was their fear. The legal framework of slavery would still exist in the former Confederate states as well as the Union slave states that had been exempted from the proclamation. So, the party committed itself to a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. The overwhelmingly Republican Senate passed the 13th Amendment by more than the necessary two-thirds majority on April 8, 1864. But not until January 31st, 1865, did enough Democrats in the House abstain or vote for the amendment to pass it by a bare two-thirds. By December 18th, 1865, the requisite three-quarters of the states had ratified the 13th Amendment, which ensured that forever after neither slave nor involuntary servitude shall exist within these United States. There are two sections to this: neither slave nor involuntary servitude, and also, Section 2, very important, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Because, you see, as I stated earlier, Abraham Lincoln did not believe he actually had the right as president to abolish slavery. However, now that the 13th Amendment was in place and it had the congressional and legislative power, it meant that the state power was now overruled. Suddenly, the federal entity had the right to decide for the slave states and freed states, the states in general, and to enforce this amendment. This means there was no getting out of freeing the blacks. This means that they had to do what the Federals did them. This was unprecedented. And the hot debate recently is whether or not Lincoln was a tyrant of sorts, because, as stated earlier, he may not have actually had the right to do so. But I digress, that's not what this video is about. This video is about the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln, as you can see this quote here, said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution." He was staunch in his anti-slavery views, and the Emancipation Proclamation was at the time seen as a desperate measure of wartime efforts, because the Civil War had been grinding and had been a meat grinder for the American populace. And it was seen as a lot of political intrigue by, upsetting the South, upsetting the status quo, freeing slave states that the Union had no power to do so. But, nevertheless, by doing so, he laid the foundation for what the Civil War would be fought over. Slavery. It would be fought over the rights of man. And now, we have this ratified Constitution with different amendments to it throughout history to adjust the federal status quo to aid the lives of its citizens. This was very important, and the Emancipation Proclamation is now over, almost 200 years. Another 16 years or so, 13 years, it'll be 100 it'll be almost 200 years. Just give us another, just give us another 40 years, and it'll be 200 years old. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. It's astounding, because this wartime action laid the foundation for one of the most important amendments in the U.S. Constitution. And Abraham Lincoln, you either hate him or you love him. There's really not an in-between on Abraham Lincoln. And with such a hot debate in the political foundations of America right now, it's important that we read this quote together. August 22nd, 1862. So, before the proclamation was put into place. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." People like to cut it off there and say, "Oh, see, he wasn't really an abolitionist." But they don't include the whole quote. The rest of the quote goes on to say, "And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." Abraham Lincoln was an astoundingly important president. What other president could have gotten us through a grueling civil war and the freeing of an enslaved populace? The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 is one of the most important stepping stones to equality in American history. And if you didn't know what the Emancipation Proclamation was, I hope you learned something from this video. I hope you learned a little something about the Civil War. I hope to make some more Civil War videos to really dig into just the meat of the Civil War and the different aspects of such a grueling encounter in American history. But I digress. With that, this has been the Shield Brother for the History Armada. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. If you did, go ahead and hit the like. If you didn't, hit me a dislike. Leave me a comment, suggestion, or concern. Hit that subscribe button. And as always, I'll catch y'all next time.